Hi there, it's me. Welcome to my channel. And that can get really broad, so we have categories to help narrow our focus. In this case, we are talking about medieval food and drink. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos. Today we're going to talk about Havsel and Grotel. 1 glass of milk, 1 glass of chopped fresh parsley, half a glass of chopped onion, 1 whole ginger, 1 whole clove, 2 bay leaves, 3 whole peppercorns, 1/2 teaspoon of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. So these amounts are actually quite generous. If we were to convert this recipe to modern measurements, this would make just over 2 cups of porridge. So we know that Havsel and Grotel would have been served in the same way. The only difference is that Havsel would have been thinner in consistency since it didn't contain any milk or cream. So this isn't anything extravagant, but it is a filling and nutritious meal for the time period. Medieval cooks had access to a wide variety of spices and herbs, many of which we still use today. 3 pounds of flour is the equivalent of about 12 cups. So this would make a very large loaf of bread. Today we're going to make a recipe for Havsel, a type of pancake. To make these pancakes, take 2 quarts of milk, 1 quart of flour, 1 whole egg, 1 whole clove, 1 bay leaf, 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of butter and oil for cooking. This recipe is also fairly unique because it uses both fresh yeast and a combination of milk and wine to make the dough. And thank you to our supporters for helping us make this series possible. Let it rest for 30 minutes, then add the butter and mix well. Heat a skillet over medium heat and add a little oil. Pour 1/2 cup of the batter onto the hot skillet and cook for 2 to 3 minutes per side or until golden brown. Serve hot with your favorite toppings. Fresh yeast was a popular leavening agent during the Middle Ages, but it was expensive and difficult to work with. During the Middle Ages, people would often top their pancakes with fruit, nuts, or cheese. The recipe makes about 12 pancakes, so feel free to double or triple it if you're feeding a crowd. Dried yeast was just starting to become available, but it was still considered an exotic ingredient. Most medieval bakers relied on a combination of stale bread and water to leaven their dough. But sometimes wealthier bakers would use milk, beer, or wine. The addition of these liquids helped to tenderize the dough and add flavor to the final product. Wine in particular was thought to improve the texture and flavor of the bread, making it more suitable for special occasions. The addition of sugar, ginger, and honey would have made this bread very sweet by medieval standards. Poppy seeds were also a rare and expensive spice during the Middle Ages. They were most often used in sweet dishes like this one. And these recipes are proof that medieval people knew how to use them. A skilled cook could turn a simple bowl of grain into a flavorful and aromatic masterpiece. All it took was a little bit of creativity and a good understanding of spices. Also keep in mind that the term glass was an inaccurate measurement. Another popular type of Havsel was a type of flatbread. Let it sit for about 10 minutes, then add 1 cup of flour and 1 cup of sugar. Continue to mix until the dough is smooth and elastic. Add another 2 cups of flour and repeat the process. Once you've added all the flour, cover the bowl and let the dough rise in a warm place for about 1 hour. Once it has doubled in size, punch down the dough and roll it out into a rectangle. Spread the remaining sugar, ginger, and honey on top of the dough, then roll it back up and tuck in the ends to seal it. Roll it out again into a rectangle and roll it up tightly. Place the loaf in a greased baking dish and let it rise again for 30 minutes. Brush the top with milk and sprinkle it with poppy seeds. Bake it in a preheated oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour or until golden brown. One of our recipes refers to a recipe for a sweetbread that is sweetened with ginger and honey and sprinkled with poppy seeds. This recipe is called Havsel mit dem Gussen, or Havsel with the good taste. The recipe calls for 3 pounds of flour, 1 pound of fresh yeast, 2 gallons of milk, 1 gallon of wine, 3 pounds of sugar, 1/2 pound of ginger, 1 pint of honey, and poppy seeds for sprinkling. Glasses weren't standardized, so you can't be certain that every glass was exactly 4 ounces. There was a lot of guesswork involved, which meant that cooks often had to adjust recipes based on the amounts of liquid that they ended up with. This type of flexibility was important because food was often prepared for large feasts, where the host wouldn't know the exact number of guests who would show up. So if you had extra broth, you could always thicken it up with more grain, or if you had too much grain, you could always add more water or milk to thin it out. Then take 4 glasses of water, boil them together, and then simmer until it is reduced to 1 cup. Then throw in 4 glasses of wheat kernels and boil them until the liquid has been absorbed. Turn it off and let it rest for 2 hours. After the resting period, you will need to sift the mixture and serve it hot with the remaining liquid on top. Now both of these dishes feature ingredients that were commonly available during the Middle Ages. As a porridge, the wheat berries would have softened and plumped up, absorbing all of the flavors of the broth. The acidity of the vinegar adds a nice tanginess to cut through the richness of the milk, and the spices bring warmth and depth to the dish. We know that the onion would have been cooked down into a sweet mushy texture, and the ginger would have added its pungent flavor to the dish. In general, the spice combination of ginger, cloves and pepper was very popular during the Middle Ages, frequently showing up in soups, stews and sauces. Of course, we don't know exactly what the parsley tasted like, but modern parsley tends to have a strong anise flavor and a slightly bitter taste. But keep in mind that during the Middle Ages, herbs were often harvested before they went to seed, which would have made them much more palatable. However, when we look at recipes from the time period, we see that Havsel had many different definitions. Sometimes it was used to describe a thickened porridge-like consistency. That would include ingredients like eggs, ginger, and raisins. Or sometimes it was a synonym for farin, which was a thick soup or stew. During the Middle Ages, the definition of a word could change depending on what part of Europe you were in. You might hear the same word for something completely different. And that was certainly the case with Havsel. Game meats like hare or venison were common, as were grains like wheat and barley, and of course vegetables such as carrots, onions, and parsnips. Grotel contains milk or cream, while Havsel does not. When we look at the first recipe from our source book, we see that they are practically interchangeable. The recipe is called Ein Havsel zu großen, or a great Havsel, and it includes a recipe for both Havsel and Grotel. The measurements are given in terms of glass, which is a medieval drinking vessel that held roughly 4 ounces or 120 milliliters. What's interesting about them is that they're very easy to prepare with little risk of spoiling. They also have long shelf lives, meaning that they could be prepared in advance and stored for future consumption. These ingredients are also inexpensive and easy to transport, making them ideal for a medieval peasant or even a medieval merchant traveling across Europe. Now if you're new here, welcome. This is a space where we talk about all things related to medieval history. So today we're looking at Havsel and Grotel, two very similar dishes that have their roots in 14th century Germany. In medieval German, the word Havsel means broth. It was typically made with water or milk and flavored with spices or herbs. Havsel and Grotel are very similar to each other. In fact, they're almost identical except for one key ingredient. For the Grotel, take 1 glass of white wine vinegar. This recipe is a great example of how Grotel would have been served. Now remember, this recipe is supposed to make enough food to serve for people. When we look at the recipe for Havsel, we see it is nearly identical except for the substitution of water for the milk. The spices and the grains remain the same. In modern times, we think of medieval food as being bland and watery, but that simply wasn't the case. As we said earlier, the term Havsel was somewhat ambiguous and could refer to many different types of foods. To make this recipe, start by mixing together the yeast and some warm water in a large bowl. Again, this recipe is designed to feed a large crowd. As you can tell, the term Havsel was used to describe a wide variety of dishes, from a simple porridge to a fancy loaf of bread. Mix together the milk, flour, egg, clove, bay leaf, and salt in a large bowl. These pancakes are very similar to modern crepes, and they can be served either sweet or savory. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Food in the Time of. Please let me know what you thought.